Yeah, 50 years later, the Buffalo Springfield still have it right. Something's happening here, and what it is ain't exactly clear. And Retake Our Democracy, in its blog and in this show, tries to shed light on what's happening and what you can do about it. Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a 30-minute weekly show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your Santa Fe public radio station. It also streams from ksfr.org. And I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. And today we're going to have a conversation with three of the leaders of the Tribal Education Alliance in New Mexico. Jasmine Yepa from the Hetmas Pueblo, and a policy analyst and Native American Budget and Policy Institute person, and coordinator of the Tribal Education Alliance, which is something we'll be talking about a fair amount today. And we also have Conroy Chino from the Acoma Pueblo. He has a long career in investigative journalism and served in the, as a Secretary of Labor in the Richardson administration. He's a lobbyist for the Tribal Education Alliance. And we also have Derrick, Representative Derrick Lente, who is currently the chair of the House Agriculture and Water Resources Committee and a vice chair of the Water and Natural Resources Committee. So last week I took a week off and we replayed one of the most viewed interviews we've ever done. It was a discussion with internationally recognized climate catastrophe author, the author of The End of Ice, Dar Jamal. The week prior, I interviewed Senate Pro Tem-elect Mimi Stewart in a very interesting interview where she discussed her legislative priorities for the session and also her approach to serving as pro tem. If you missed either of those conversations, or if you are driving around today and don't catch all of this conversation, you can watch all of our past shows by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and hovering over the actions and events page and clicking on Retake Conversations. Today's discussion will be posted by noon, but usually by 9 a.m. we post it. Before we begin, I want to share a couple of brief announcements. First, at the beginning of every Retake Zoominar, I offer an acknowledgement of our being on stolen Tewa land. I've never done that on the radio show before, but last week I was struck by how planners for a Green Amendment Steering Committee meeting began their meeting with an acknowledgement, and I resolved to start doing that on the radio show. And that was before our scheduling our guests today, which, so I want to make that acknowledgement and thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of the land. We'll be making that acknowledgement every week from now on. I want to remind you that Retake has our 2021 legislative strategy and 15 transformational bills and 28 priority bills for which we are advocating. And we have started an advocacy work already. Our strategy is to use December and early January to organize constituent teams in each of the 27 democratically controlled Senate districts, and then for constituents to reach out to the senators to conduct Zoom conversations about the bills we support. We want to find out in December where support for our bills is strong and where some senators may need some good information on the bills we support. You don't have to be a policy wonk to be part of this effort, and Retake provides all kinds of tools and resources to support your work. Retake, if you're on our Zoom with Democratic leadership on December 1st, you heard Senator Worth indicate that he felt the time was now for passing really meaningful legislation, and we want to make sure we take advantage. The need is great, but so is the opportunity. All we need is your voice. If you're interested in more information on this, just write to retakeresponse@gmail.com. We have standing strategy meetings every Friday at 3:30 in the afternoon via Zoom, of course. We'd love to have you on those Zooms. So that's enough for now. Let's get started because we got a lot of questions and we've got three guests, so it's going to be an exciting conversation. I always like to start by letting our guests introduce themselves. And so, and tell us a little bit about how you wound up involved with the Tribal Education Alliance And let's start with Jasmine. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Ni Tokyozola, he sonde Ami. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jasmine Yepa. I am from the Pueblo of Jemez, as mentioned. I am a UNM grad, so I have my Juris Doctorate degree from there. I have a bachelor's in political science from Mount Holyoke College. And I work as a policy analyst, specifically focused on Indian education for the Native American Budget and Policy Institute, which is a brand newish institute. It's only been up for a little over, going on 3 years, or about 3 years now. And I also work in tandem with the New Mexico Center on Law and Poverty. So mainly I've been focusing on the Yazi Martinez lawsuit and how that lawsuit connects to Indian education in New Mexico in our state public schools and how it affects Native American children in Native communities.
It's interesting. On Wednesday, I'm interviewing the Center on Law and Poverty's executive director for the following week's show. So that's a coincidence. How about you next, Conroy?
My name is Conroy Chino, and I am from the Pueblo of Acoma, where I grew up. And thank you, Paul, for having us on your show, and also for your listeners who are tuning in to hear what's going to be discussed throughout your half hour. We really appreciate the time that you're taking out to focus on some major issues, what I believe is a crisis in the education of Native children here in New Mexico. But, I spent many years in the television news gathering industry, both here in Albuquerque and in Los Angeles, focusing mainly on investigative reporting, but also at the same time focused also on making film documentaries that focus primarily on Native American issues. One of the major documentaries that I'm really proud of is one called Surviving Columbus, which documents the first contact between Pueblo people here in New Mexico and Europeans. But there have been a number of documentaries that I've worked on with the help of Silver Bullet Productions, located there in Santa Fe. But as you indicated, I also was a member of Governor Richardson's cabinet. Seems like 100 years ago. But soon after I left the news business, I was contacted by the governor's transition team, and they brought me on board. But since then, I have been working with tribes as a tribal lobbyist, but more recently working with the Tribal Education Alliance. And you'll hear more about what the Alliance is about and what we hope to achieve by the creation of this advocacy group. And we're hoping that this coming session, there will be some productive results.
Okay, well, we've got a legislator here to weigh in on that. Representative Lente, can you introduce yourself? Tell us a little how you wound up in the House, and then how your interest in education and specifically has evolved.
Sure. Makua, Hino Mopewan Kerimba. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Paul, Mr. Chino, Ms. Yepa. Good morning to everybody. Proud to be here joining the stage with all of you this morning. I'm from Sandia Pueblo. I'm a product of New Mexico's public school system, specifically the Bernalillo public school system. I was able to then go to the University of New Mexico, where I did also, like Ms. Yepa, receive my Juris Doctorate degree. And in 2017, everything's about timing, obviously, in life. And so the timing was right for me to make a run for the legislative seat in my district. And I did, and I was able to win. And since then, I've been a proud member of the legislature. most recently joining the leadership team in 2019 as the chairman, as you mentioned, for the Water and Agricultural Committee in the House. And my interest and my working with TEA is obviously as a product of public schools. My wife also works at the Bernalillo High School, and I know that there are a number of other Native American students and children throughout this state, Indian and non-Indian alike, that are just like me, that grew up just like me, that had a lot of things against me. And knowing that education can be the great equalizer for a lot of different things, I have used the platform of this legislative office to then try to open up doors, to try to provide equity, to try to provide opportunity to all these students from various different backgrounds, to make sure that they have a shot at receiving an education that they could be proud of here in our state. And that for many of those that come from our state are indigenous, whether you're, again, Native American, Hispanic, wherever you might come from, are indigenous and want to stay here, and we want to keep you here. And so for that, for all those reasons, my interest has become largely education related, because I see the interest, and again, I see the value in being able to provide our students that education opportunity. And so for that reason, Paul and others, I am so happy and I'm so honored to be a part of this team that TEA is, because I think it has done some great things and has brought together some of the most impressive minds and impressive strategists in our state, if not in our nation, to focus on the education of our most vulnerable populations.
Okay, thank you for that. I think that gives our listeners a good bare understanding of who we're talking with today. Let's start with either Jasmine or Conroy. Anyone paying any attention understands that COVID has had a devastating impact on tribal communities throughout the nation, and specifically in New Mexico. But what has been the impact of the COVID-19 on Native students?
Paul, I can respond and provide some answers perhaps to your question. I'll start, and Jasmine can certainly jump in and add to what I'm going to share with you and your listeners. And that is, those of us that have been watching news accounts since March and the outbreak of this pandemic, particularly those that have been paying close attention to the impact on tribal communities, have seen how this pandemic has really affected and impacted tribal communities disproportionately compared to maybe others throughout New Mexico, when it comes to health, when it comes to other areas. But even more so, it's really exposed glaring disparities in tribal communities. But more specifically to your question about how it's impacted Native children, one of the things that we became aware of early on with the Tribal Education Alliance was the lack of broadband infrastructure on or near tribal communities, the inability of students who are now reduced to online learning, not being able to access the internet. There already were conditions like this that existed in tribal communities. I was told out at Acoma, for example, where I'm from, that students would get sent home, particularly when they had to take the park test or had to do homework, had to drive to a local McDonald's that is located off reservation and sit in the parking lot and access the internet that way to be able to do homework. Now they're having to resort to jetpacks and hotspots if they can. They're still having to drive to parking lots around tribal community buildings where they can access internet. So it's created a great deal of challenge and difficulty for many children. I remember seeing a photo of a Navajo parent in somewhat of a remote area where they lived, sitting with his daughter on a hilltop, she with her laptop, the dad sitting next to her, and all you saw in the background was this open, sparse area. but that was the only place where she could access the internet. And so it's those kind of conditions that exist in rural communities, which are already very, very rural, located miles away from urban areas. And unfortunately, many families that live in our tribal communities here in New Mexico are low income. So as a result, can't pay for monthly internet services, can't provide their children with the kind of technology that's necessary for them to learn. But one of the things that I'm most concerned about that I saw in a recent LFC report was the learning loss that has really affected Native children, a setback. I mean, they're already experiencing setbacks in many areas. So we've seen the graduation rates, we've seen the dropout rates among Native students, but even more so now with the pandemic, the loss of learning, which according to this LFC report was anywhere from 3 months to a year. And so it creates a great deal of inequity. It creates gaps in the education of our Native children. But the last thing I want to point out, Paul, is really the loss of students. Many Native children, I'm told, have just simply stopped engaging with online learning. And the numbers are high. I mean, I was told they're anywhere between 30 and 40%. And because of the lockdowns and because tribal communities have restricted who goes into their communities, schools, school counselors or teachers can't visit with their students, can't visit with and to find out where are my students. So those are the number of things I think that the pandemic has really challenges that the pandemic has really created for Native children and tribal communities.
And Jasmine, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think Conroy did a really terrific job in really laying out what's happening, the landscape right now. And in regards to, the movement that our organization, as well as the larger group of folks, all folks really in Indian country, trying to engage in the process of transformation of our education system due to this amazing lawsuit, Yazi Martinez. COVID has really put a damper and put a hold on all of that progress that we were hoping to make. And so for me, I think the only thing that I would point out is that Native students, as well as students with special needs, English language learners, low income students, also known as our transient students, really have a higher need for programs and services that we know would help them succeed better in school, even the playing field with their non-at-risk counterparts or classmates. And so how are kids getting those services, such as special education, counseling, etc.? That COVID makes that even harder to come by, especially for our students who have issues with connecting to the internet, as Conroy had mentioned. So I just wanted to point that out as well.
Okay, well, the next question was to deal with the internet impact, the impact of the internet, and I think Conroy and Jasmine have covered that. So let's move on to Representative Lente. Are you aware of any legislation for the 2021 session that would address the lack of infrastructure in rural and tribal communities? I mean, COVID has clearly illustrated the critical importance of good infrastructure, running water, electricity, and internet. Is anything brewing to address this dire need?
Paul, I do believe that Senator Padilla from Albuquerque does have an internet infrastructure piece of legislation. I have not yet seen that, but I also have, with the assistance of the TEA team, have developed a bill that I've presented for the past 2 sessions prior to 2021 related to tribal libraries and broadband and internet infrastructure expansions. And so those types of things, we even before the ruling in the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit, were the things that TEA and the larger group were talking about in regards to the discrepancies and the disparities that are taking place in tribal areas in our state. And so all that COVID has done to this point has illuminated and has basically proven the point that, in fact, we were not just chasing after dollars, we were not just barking up the wrong tree, that we were not just the squeaky wheel that needed the grease, that we were in fact the people that live at the villages, at the tribal communities, that have gone out to those communities, have talked to the students, to the parents, to the tribal leaders, and understood their frustrations and brought to light that in a very much larger platform in the New Mexico legislature. And at this point, over the past 2 years, while very much embraced in regards to the acceptance that other legislators agree that yes, internet infrastructure is important, broadband expansion is important, the dollars have yet to be expended and provided for us to make any type of real type of progress into those tribal communities and rural communities to help us enhance what we have on the ground in our communities. Because right now, Conroy, I think, provided an illumination of what an illustration, excuse me, of what it is like currently today. And it is unfortunate, it is sad, and it should not be happening in any one of our states, in any one of our communities, in any portion of this nation. Because at this point, it just continues to go to the point of how Native Americans have become, again, the most excluded and the highly disregarded people in our nation. And it's not okay with me.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And I need to just take a quick break and remind our listeners that it is in times like these that KSFR is more important than ever, offering timely news and alerts and a wide range of programming to keep you sane while you're holed up at home. So for those of you who can afford it, please consider making a donation and think of it as your ticket for admission to a wealth of really great programming. So just go to ksfr.org, click on the donate button, and do what you can. And so today we're speaking with 3 leaders from the Tribal Education Alliance, Jasmine Yepa, Conroy Chino, and Representative Derrick Lente. So let's return to that discussion. Jasmine, I know that the TEA is deeply involved in trying to transform education for Indigenous children. Can you tell us about the experience of Native kids in the public schools, and what are some of the problems you yourself encountered, and what are the problems facing this new generation of students?
Sure. So in our work early on, we basically hit the road and conducted summits, education summits in as many tribal communities, if not all tribal communities. We did host a convening that was for all of the pueblos, all in one. But we did speak with representatives of each tribal community in our state, and heard feedback on the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit. And at the time, there was an organization, the Transform Education NM organization. They had put together a Yazzie remedy platform, basically a list of recommendations on how to transform the education system. So what we did in our convenings in the community, at the community level, is we talked about the lawsuit, we talked about these recommendations, and we heard firsthand knowledge how those recommendations would work out in that local community, and what it would mean for those children. And so basically we hear that funding is a huge issue. We know the curriculum that students are lacking culturally and linguistically relevant curriculum, meaning they don't always have access to true Indigenous stories that are, our Indigenous people and ancestors were involved in New Mexico history. So they don't always get the full picture there. Many students who might have access, Native American students who might have access to a bilingual program that is in their own Indigenous language might not, that program might not be elevated to a level of functionality that it really could have due to lack of funding from the Indian Education Fund and the Indian Education Division within PED. And so there's basically these three main themes that we're seeing that need to change. That there needs to be a shared responsibility with tribal leadership and tribal communities and governments alongside our state government, which is the PED, Public Education Department, and our local school districts. And then the second theme would be, having culturally and linguistically community-based education. I kind of merged the last two together, but really elevating and building capacity in our communities, so that way kids who need access to after-school programs, kids who need access to culturally and linguistically relevant counseling services and special education services, that they're getting all of these services in the schools, but it's also coming from a culturally sensitive and respectful lens, so that we're no longer creating the circles or feeding the circles of what some would call institutional racism in our schools. That's something that I've heard, and I've also somewhat dealt with when I was a student in public schools really young. And that's something that we hear from our Native American students today, is that they still are feeling the effects of that, and they still see it in their classrooms, and that's something that we're trying to address.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. And so Representative Lente, the courts have weighed in on these kinds of systemic educational inequities with the Yazzie Martinez court ruling. And why is this important for Native kids?
Well, it verifies everything that Jasmine just spoke of in regards to TEA and the team going out to each individual tribal nation in their communities and talking to the leadership, to the parents, to the students, and hearing all the frustrations and finding out that, yes, in fact, in the court's ruling, that it is validated that all those types of things are in fact wrong, need to be changed. And the state needs to own up to its constitutional requirement to provide every student in our state an equitable opportunity at an education. And until that happens, that ruling stands as an affirmation to all of us, if you will, brown people, red people, minority people in a majority minority state, that yes, things are not okay, that things have to change, that we have to make improvements, and those improvements come down to being very expensive. And I've used this very multiple times in my explanation, is that failure is expensive. So in this case, the court is now going to hold our state responsible, as it should be, to making sure that every child in our state has a right to an equitable education.
Okay, well, thank you. And we have blown through 28 minutes. And so I'd like to give Jasmine or Conroy an opportunity to let us know how they can get more information, how people can get more information on the Tribal Education Alliance.
Paul, this is Conroy. What we would really like to have the public become aware of is a document that's going to be published and rolled out pretty soon. It's a report called Pathways to Education Sovereignty, Standing for Native American Children. And what this report does is really attempts to address the inequities that both the representative and Jasmine have pointed out to your listening audience that currently exist in New Mexico. And so we're hoping that once this report becomes fully public, that your listening audience might be able to get a copy, probably online would be the best way to get it. And in it, they'll find a very in-depth analysis based on evidence, on historic documents, research, but really laid out in a way that I think is understandable and easy to follow along and really goes to the message that we want to share with your audience, and that is something needs to change. Transformational measures need to be put in place to address the crisis that exists right now in the education of Native children.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And Jasmine, do you want to real quickly, because we're running over, give the website where the report might be available and other information might be available?
Sure. It's going to be located on the Native American Budget and Policy Institute's website. That's nabpi.unm.edu. And that's the main page. And there is a link or a button to press called Tribal Remedy Framework. And once you enter that page, folks can find 3 documents. And the document that Conroy mentioned will be available for the public on that website fairly soon.
Okay, well, thank you all for being with us today. We're going to continue this conversation for our podcast, but I want to thank our listeners for listening in. We'll be back next week with the executive director from the New Mexico Center for Law and Poverty. So thank you very much for listening. Stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay home. And we'll be back next week. Thank you very much. Okay, we're back, and you're publishing this. We were just talking about this report. Why do we need another report about education? Don't we know what's wrong and what needs to be fixed? And what's the report's goal?
You know, Paul, to your first question, why do we need another report? Well, we wouldn't need another report if there wasn't this crisis in the education of Native children. Right. But there is one. There is one, and it's became glaringly apparent, I believe, when this historic law ruling in the lawsuit called Yazzie Martinez came down or was handed down several years back. And, you know, all the inequities, the gaps in the academic achievement of Native children, the failure by the state to educate Native children was all laid out in this lawsuit. And along with that came mandates from the court that oversaw this, this case. And it called for a comprehensive plan to address these systemic inequities. And the state really hasn't been quick to respond with a plan or to make the necessary investment to address these gaps in education. So this report, this goal really is to address the systemic inequities that exist and the gaps that have been created in the academic success of Native children. It again wants to make the public aware of what occurred as a result of this lawsuit. And it's really a very in-depth analysis of a document that has been described on the show earlier called the Tribal Remedy Framework. And others on the show have kind of laid out the background for this Tribal Remedy Framework. And so what this report did was go in and analyze, took a really in-depth look at this Tribal Remedy Framework, and then brought forward some solutions. So the goal is to have policymakers and hopefully the state's public education department look at these solutions and build a comprehensive plan around them. One is to have tribes have a shared responsibility in the schooling and the education of their children, having some control over not only what they're being taught, but how they're being taught. So that's one piece. One is to really begin to focus on what we call community-based education that's elevating the tribal education departments that exist in tribal communities around New Mexico, providing them with adequate funding through the state's school funding formula, as well as providing funding for Representative Lente, who has been the prime sponsor and a great advocate for this too, and that is to fund tribal libraries. You know, many of them are just old, dilapidated buildings that probably were not, really constructed to be used as libraries, but to be able to house, once they're built, summer school, extended learning, early education programs, the teaching of indigenous languages. So all of that contained in these this community-based hub, if you will, these centers that will exist on tribal communities, but working in tandem with the local school district, contracting or entering into agreements with school districts to provide student services, mental health and behavioral health services, and as well as working with higher education institutions. Many of them, like UNM and Highlands University, have these programs that need to be tapped into, and to be able to provide then this information to these community-based education centers, and use them not only within the tribal community, but also shared with school districts. So that's what the report is all about. It lays all that out. There was reference earlier to culturally and linguistically relevant material being developed. So all of that can take place in and around these concepts of community-based education.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Conroy. And once that document is published, Retake will definitely do a blog about it and publish the links to it and so forth. So, Jasmine, do you think that non-Native people understand the extent of harm that the public education has sort of inflicted and continues to inflict on tribal communities?
I wish my answer would be yes, but I don't think so. We've known for many years that Native American students need a very specialized and unique type of education to right the wrongs of the past. However, it's something that our state really struggles in doing wholeheartedly, I would say. And a lot of it has to do with what I believe is funding our programs adequately. A lot of folks will say Yazzie Martinez is only about funding. Really, it's not. Just as Conroy had mentioned, it's about building capacity at the local level. It's about, for our Native American communities, it's about the curriculum being relevant for our Native students. It's about even programs and services coming from an equity-based lens of being culturally and linguistically respectful for our kids and our families, mainly because we know the history of education. For Indian education, it was very brutal. It started with the boarding school era, and children being ripped away from their communities and their families and forced to attend these boarding schools that would whitewash them into mainstream American society. Kill the Indian, save the man was the motto of these boarding schools that were really developed to assimilate Native American children into white mainstream culture and get them kind of out of the thinking of an indigenous way of thinking and being. And so when we know that that is the history of Indian education, we must absolutely be working from a place of equity and a place of consciousness of really trying to uplift the community and trying to uplift tribal government systems and respecting tribal sovereignty. That's something that we even struggle with today. I would say that. And so many non-Native people who come into our schools and our communities to try to do good, or at least try to get educational output, meaning test scores and grades and graduation rates, trying to increase these numbers. That's all fine and good, but when we're doing that and pushing Native American languages and stories and experiences aside to only focus on those test scores and those grades that are not coming from an equitable lens, right? It's not coming from the history of our people. It's coming from a different society. Then that is in turn too is also harmful. So for Native people, for non-Native people, it's important to understand and to accept that success for Native students and communities looks different for us. It's talking about our culture, it's learning our languages, it's keeping our traditions alive while also learning, the core curriculum of any school. So that's something important for non-natives to know and to think about.
So, you were just
add-
describing, oh, go ahead. Sorry, Conroy.
I was just going to add a couple more comments to what Jasmine has added, and that's where, to your question, I really believe that a lot of people don't know enough about indigenous communities, Native people, even here in New Mexico. So many of the notions, concepts, ideas, images of Native people are formed by Hollywood and stereotypes and misinformation about Native people. And unfortunately, teachers carry those kind of misinformation and maybe even stereotypes, whether they know it or not, forms and creates biases and prejudices as they go into a classroom and deal with Native students, not knowing who they are, not knowing what they're about. And so I think it's going to take a lot, and a lot of it's going to include training teachers, training administrators, in order for them to become more culturally aware and culturally sensitive to the Native student that sits in their classroom.
So this is also for you, Jasmine, and also for you, Representative Lente. To what degree is there like a shared understanding within the Indigenous community of how important this issue is? And is there a groundswell of advocacy within the Indigenous community that is pressing for the kind of education reform that's called for in Yazzie and Martinez?
I'll jump in really quickly. I would say yes, that there is. We have, thankfully today, we have a plethora of Native American education advocates and experts. These are Indigenous people who were born and raised in our communities, live our experiences, know the histories, know the languages. They went off and received their degrees in education in some way or form, in some aspect and niche in education. And these people have been working their entire lives, their entire careers, dedicating to bettering the system for Native children and students and families, communities. And so I believe, yes, that there is, the Tribal Education Alliance is an example of that. We also have the All Pueblo Council of Governors, who has an education committee. These are Pueblo people focused on education challenges and issues that are happening in our communities. And for every single community, they have a tribal education department. These are people that are experts in what is happening locally at their level within their schools. And these are the folks that our tribal leadership goes to for advice and how to make these changes a reality and these transformations a reality. And I think that's all I can remember to say right now. I did have another thought. If it comes to my mind, I'll say it again. But I definitely believe that we do have people in our communities who are standing up when they see instances where their voices are not being heard, or our tribal sovereignty is being attacked or depleted in some way or form, not respected. So I definitely believe we have folks who are in our Native students' corners right now.
What about you, Representative Lente? Do your constituents press you on this issue?
Oh, absolutely, Paul. And just an observation really quick, but I think you would agree, how lucky am I to have two awesome advocates like Mr. Chino and Ms. Yepa on my team, and the number of other advocates from tribal communities and professionals from across the nation to help me with legislation, to help us with bringing light to these types of issues. And when you talk about bringing light to these issues, absolutely there is a groundswell of others, not only just in educational realms, but just simply parents, grandparents, students that are now saying, wait a minute, you're right. It's not fair. It's not okay. And I do believe that the work that we have done thus far has helped to, again, illuminate these issues on a larger, broader stage for all the state to understand, to learn, and to appreciate. And there's a few of my colleagues in the House that jokingly they say, oh, there goes Yazi Martinez, Lente, because a lot of my legislation is focused on Yazi Martinez. And perhaps, time being everything, and timing is everything, I have to think that my time in a legislature coinciding with the decision in Yazi Martinez has to mean something. And my ability to then now articulate what Native America, New Mexico is about, what the decision means to our people, and how that decision can help our people, and how to help articulate now to our state executive, to our state legislature, making the connections as to how important it is that we respond in very bold fashions to make sure that we don't lose this really profound decision that was made on Native America and education's behalf. Because this, for all intents and purposes, could be our Brown versus Board of Education, but in New Mexico. And so when I think of these issues, I will aggressively, in some cases, argue our points, make sure that our voices are heard, so that the people that stand not behind me, but with me, in front of me, around us all, don't have to feel like they're afraid that they bring up issues of inequity, or they bring up issues of systemic racism, or they bring up issues of other things where things they know and they understand are not fair, that they can also have a voice and not feel like they're going to be shunned or pushed away, but that they will be accepted, respected, and understood.
Thank you for that, Representative Lente. And I have another question for you. I've been told that Speaker Egolf is asking legislators to limit the number of bills that they introduce to 5 during this COVID kind of constrained session. This will certainly force legislators to prioritize. What are your legislative priorities? And I'm guessing and hoping that they include some legislation around water resources that you might be introducing or interested in seeing advance.
I appreciate the question, Paul. You're correct that we have been asked that 5 be a maximum amount of legislation that each legislator carry. And I can tell you right off the bat is that 3 of them are a continuation of the Yazi Martinez focused pieces of legislation that I've carried over the past 2 sessions. And because I think we cannot let go of the opportunity that we have at this point. And to do so would not only just be unfortunate for all the work that the team has done, but be truly unfortunate for all the children that are coming up behind us all. And so I can tell you that much. And in regards to the water resources aspect, there are a few water related bills that I have seen come up, and I have not signed on to anything yet. But it's yet to be known how I want to, I guess, strategically use my 2 other chances for pieces of legislation in 2021.
It probably won't be on a memorial.
Highly unlikely.
That's one positive out of this. No memorials to the green chili cheeseburger this session. Last question for you, Representative Lente. And by the way, just if you send me information about the 3 bills you're advancing, we'll make sure they're among our priority bills. The library one already is. Last question for you though, what can Retake do to support you during this upcoming legislative session?
The number of supporters that TEA has helped to accumulate, in addition to all of the tribes, pueblos, and nations in our state, with the parents, the students, the education advocates, have become a great following. And what your organization could likely do is absolutely endorse our pieces of legislation that we have upcoming. As a matter of fact, it's funny that I just got a text from Legislative Council that the 3 pieces of legislation related to Yazzie Martinez are done in the drafting stages, and I'm going to look at them today, and then we'll pre-file those things. And so it's something that I will absolutely share with your organization. And if it's something that you feel strong enough about that you can stand behind, we would appreciate that enthusiasm by way of saying, you know what, we're going to ask our membership to also talk about this, to also become educated about this, to also tell their legislators that this is important to them as well, and that they too should help support these types of initiatives. So Paul, for your organization, I think simply getting out the groundswell with the rest of us is going to be work enough. So thank you for that offer.
Yeah, no, we you know, I don't know how much you appreciate. We've been for 4 sessions, we've been operating a statewide alert system. So it's not just a Santa Fe organization. We have representatives throughout the state, and the people who read retake stuff are active. They're not quiet. So the support will translate into contacting other legislators, their legislators. So we will definitely do that. So this is the last question. It's for Jasmine and Conroy. What can Retake and its supporters do to support your work, and where can they get their hands on your report? We sort of asked that during the radio show, but it's good to do it again at the end.
The one thing I would ask of the listeners and your organization, Paul, is that they impress upon lawmakers when the session starts next month to commit, as well as to act, take action, and invest, with the understanding that the education of Native children needs to be owned by everyone, not just Native families, not just tribal communities. It is not just an Indian issue, nor should it be, hopefully, a racial issue, but really it's a matter that needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed by everyone, including the state.
Jasmine, you want to finish up?
Sure. I am just 100% supportive of what Conroy said. I don't really have anything else to add. I just want to highlight what he said. I think that is really important. Where listeners can find all of our documents, they can go to the Native American Budget and Policy Institute's website. That is nabpi.unm.edu, and click on Tribal Remedy Framework, which is a button or a header on the webpage. And on that page, the TRF page is what we call it, there are currently 3 documents, the full Tribal Remedy Framework, a summary document, and the list of legislation that was put forth during the regular 2020 session. So we will be adding more documents to that website. So that is one to that link is one to keep and remember, and to visit every now and then for new documents.
Okay, well, I really want to thank all 3 of you for taking this much time. It's we had a lot of questions, and you went into great depth, and so thank you, Representative Lente. Thank you, Ms. Yepa and Mr. Chino, and for taking this time. It's been a very eye-opening conversation, and I'm sure our listeners and viewers will appreciate it very much. In closing, I just want to remind our listeners that we'll be back next week with the executive director from the New Mexico Center for Law and Poverty. And I just want to encourage you, you got to stay active. That's the only way we fix this mess. Thank you very much. And